I'll come on to that. But essentially, the overwhelming majority of the population and the vast majority of working people now distrust the key institutions of the capitalist state in Britain and oppose the basic beliefs of the ruling class. I mean, since these graphs ended, just to give you a few examples, things have got a lot worse for the establishment. By 2014, nearly 70% of the whole population supported increasing taxes on the rich. 56% thought that reducing inequality was more important than increasing wealth, the direct opposite, obviously, of the kind of establishment view. And so on and so on in terms of these particular kind of indexes. But I think it's more serious than that, actually, for the elites, because I think what has really shocked them is that the opposition has opposition over a series of issues has coalesced into a left-wing, a kind of popular left-wing politics in Britain, which is joined up, which aspires not just to redistribution and renationalisation of key industries, but in general to sort of more economic power to the people. And as I say, this is something that I think they thought had been consigned to the dustbin of history. It's been crystallised, obviously, by the brilliant campaign that's been run by Team Corbyn. But actually, it's quite interesting, and the reason why I picked these graphs is that I think these graphs show that the process predated the emergence of Corbynism, and I think that's an interesting point. A 2014 survey found that, quotes, when it comes to capitalism, the public is to the left of every mainstream party. Around the same time, the editor of City AM complained in an article titled, "There is sadly mass support for nationalisation and price controls," that slowly but surely the public is turning its back on the free market economy and re-embracing an atavistic version of socialism, which, if implemented, would end in tears. And you know, this was actually confirmed, this view. It's not just the sort of impressions of a posh editor. There was a poll very early in 2016 which showed that that more people are favourable to socialism in Britain than are favourable to capitalism. And clearly this is something that they thought could never happen. Now, I could go on about the question of control. I don't want to. I just want to say two other things, which are slightly more general. The first one is that the establishment, I think, and the politicians have lost control and coherence on their side as well. And, you know, the Tories' crisis of leadership is obviously a talent deficit at one level. They're talking about, you know, Jacob Rees-Mogg being the next blue-eyed boy. They clearly have a problem on that front. But also, I think it reflects much deeper things. It reflects divisions over Brexit, and more deeply, it reflects an impasse over really what to do about British capitalism. And the second point flows from that, which is that, you know, neoliberalism really is in deep crisis. I mean, the ruling class has done very well out of it in the immediate way, and Danny Dorney's been one of the people that's really kind of recorded this, but done very well out of it in the immediate sense of it being a kind of social, a kind of elite raid on social wealth. But the rest of it is bad news. I mean, first of all, neoliberalism has clearly caused immense suffering for the vast majority of the population. Secondly, it's led to a series of, drawn Britain into a series of very unpopular and devastating foreign wars. And finally, it's failed catastrophically in its own terms. I mean, all the promises it made about trickle down, about reducing the debt, about efficiency, about stability, about creating jobs, about growth, about restoring profitability. It has done none of these things. And it's visibly failed, and clearly 2008 was the big moment for that. So you don't have to be Antonio Gramsci to recognise that this combination of mass immiseration on the one hand and, you know, profound and abject project failure on the other hand is not a good look really for any elite. And I think it adds up really to a profound breakdown of what he called hegemony. So why does this matter? I mean, just a few comments. It seems to me that unless we on the left, grasp the kind of scale, first of all, of the radicalisation, and secondly, of the actual crisis of the capitalist system, really, and the depth of it, and the systemic nature of it, I think there's a danger that we end up stuck in too defensive a posture. and I mean this in terms of obviously the Corbyn project on the one hand. It's there's an ongoing debate about maintaining the radicalism of that project. It seems to me that the project will not be able to appeal to people who've been pummeled in this way and in this depth of a sort of crisis situation unless it maintains that radicality. But I think there's a wider question for the whole of the left, which is we have to be on the offensive, we have to be ambitious, we have to be thinking in terms of fire starting rather than firefighting, and we have to not be defensive, because I think if we aren't, then paradoxically we'll have a situation where the establishment will actually be able to restore control. And I think the restoration of control by the establishment in the current circumstances will not be a pretty sight. So that's a few thoughts about why it matters. I mean, I was going to say a few words about the fact that how surprising it is in a way that anyone was surprised given this data. You know, that it came as such a shock to almost everyone in public life, it seems to me, this series of kickbacks in the political realm. I haven't really got time to go into that. I go into it in the book. Suffice to say that I think the ruling class, almost by definition, is incapable of understanding the kind of flaws and contradictions in its own system. The commentariat is a more interesting question. Why they not just fail to predict, but actually continue to fail to explain and to make the connections. It seems to me that, well, two words really: one, privilege; two, Blair. But I'll leave that there for the moment. And really, the sort of final, or the last part of what I want to say concerns questions for the left. Because it seems to me that this series of events, and actually the whole way in which it has taken people by surprise, even on the left, raises questions for us as well. And the last part of the book is actually kind of more theoretical. The first part is a kind of trying to tell a story about really what has happened up until the election, the general election. But the last part of it is a little bit more theoretical, and I want to just touch on three main points. The first one is, I think it's very important that the left doesn't overplay the power of ruling class ideas, because it is actually very fashionable, particularly in the academic left, to argue that people are kind of living in various ideological prisons, that we're unable to see the reality of the world around us, that that power is so embedded in everyday life, or that the media is so powerful that we can't see beyond it. I mean, you know, you get that in Foucault, who's very fashionable. I think you get that to a much lesser extent, but still importantly in Chomsky. I mean, even a left-wing philosopher of the calibre of Frederick Jameson famously said in 2004 that it is easier for people to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Now, it's a clever quote, and, you know, maybe there's an element of truth in it, but actually I think it's, you know, this was 3 or 4 years after the massive anti-capitalist protests around the world, where, you know, the G8 and the IMF were chased out of the centres of major European cities and so on and so forth. This was a year after the big anti-war protests, which I think had a strong anti-capitalist element to them. So I think this idea, and it actually extends beyond academia. I mean, looking back to the 80s, one of the ways in which Neil Kinnock in particular managed to justify the move to the right of the Labour Party was precisely by saying, we can't beat Murdoch, we can't challenge the ruling class narrative. If you can't beat them, join them. You know, we have to accept the free market, we have to abandon, you know, trade union militancy, all these things. It was this idea that ruling class ideas completely dominate the working class, I think is a big one. And I contend in the book that actually, that Marxism, more than any other method or tool, has a way of understanding consciousness that is more insightful than all of these things, because it understands the contradictory nature of particularly working class consciousness, but consciousness across society under capitalism, where capitalism actually generates at certain times resistance as well as resignation, that it creates both those things in different circumstances, and I think that's very, very important. And actually one variant of this kind of gloomy way of looking at the world is this idea, which is very prevalent, which is that, we seem to have lost that. It's because I'm being so interesting. Very prevalent is the idea that, you know, a social crisis of the kind that we're going through at the moment will inevitably lead to racism. It will find its fullest expression in some sort of racist nightmare or barbarity. Now, clearly, racism is a, you know, racist outcomes are a very real possibility, and you can look around the world and see all sorts of examples of where that's happened. And we have a problem with racism in Britain, and we need to build the campaign against racism on all fronts, and against Islamophobia, and in support of free movement, and all these things are very, very important. But I also think we have to understand as well that the history of the last couple of decades across Europe and beyond has been a history of a kind of contention between the left and the right, between progressive movements and reactionary movements, where both have had moments of breakout. I mean, think of the anti-capitalist movement in the early last decade, think of the international anti-war movement, think of the great anti-austerity movements in Greece, in Spain, in France. They're actually happening now in France as we speak. And then think of the wave of new electoral challenges to neoliberalism that have emerged. And you know, anyone who says that the left doesn't have a place in this situation, I think isn't understanding the dynamics of what is going on. I mean, society clearly is polarising, as it's bound to in any social crisis. But I think we have to always examine the exact terms on which it is polarising, and concretely in any particular time and place, and work from there. And I think in Britain that means, one, not falling for the caricatured view of the Brexit vote, which is that it was just an expression of anti-migrant racism or anti-immigrant racism, but understanding it's much more complex than that. And two, I think it needs understanding that at the moment in Britain, the left is in the ascendancy. The left has the initiative. Because if we don't understand that, as I say, I think we'll be too defensive. So, two last points. One is, I think there's also a danger of... Have I got time for two last points? One is there's a danger of losing sight of class as well, bizarrely on the left. Yeah. But, I mean, I think there really are an extraordinary number of attempts to downplay or even write class out of the picture at the moment. You know, Paul Mason does it, to be honest. This Guy Standing famously does it. There was a BBC survey of the class, a very popular one, not from the left, but still it was a kind of liberal thing, which came out about 4 or 5 years ago, which had 8 different classes in British society, and none of them were determined by occupation. What you did for a living wasn't even a question. You know, there's a constant attempt by sociologists to break down the question of class and to deny, certainly particularly to deny the reality of working class life. Now, clearly there are problems that we face, that workers face, precarity and division, and you know, on all sorts of different bases. There's a low level of strike action. All these things are taken for granted. But the idea that working people in Britain do not have an interest in combining together, organising together, and fighting for better conditions, which is essentially the point of the argument about class, seems to me to be absolutely absurd. I think that actually the working life in Britain is an absolute horror at the moment, and I think the recent sort of mini wave of strikes shows, I think, that people do understand that actually class is important. You wouldn't know this from the discussion. 60% of British people self-define as working class when asked. You know, I mean, it's just, you know, this kind of sociological academic attempt to take class apart, I think, is very dangerous. Final point, in terms of the sort of discussions on the left, is that I also argue for the importance of, in terms of this analysis, the importance of mass movements and self-activity, which is, you know, you might say is obvious, but in a way, again, time after time, even on the left, I think there's an underplaying of how important campaigning and protest and rank and file activity really is. I mean, there's a number of books being written, for example, about Jeremy's rise and what's happened. I think Alex Nunn's is excellent, and Alex Nunn does talk about the importance of, you know, the kind of various waves of mass protest in Britain over the last 10 years in the emergence of Jeremy's project. But his is the only one that does, and these are left-wing books. Everything's about Parliament, everything's about the top of society without understanding. And it seems to me that, you know, social movements have shaped Britain over the last 20 or 30 years, probably more than any other single thing. That's the reality. I mean, if you think about the Anti-Nazi League, the anti-nuclear protests, I mean, and in every way shaped in different ways. The miners' strike, the defeat of the miners' strike, the poll tax movement, the anti-war movement, the pro-Palestine movement, the anti-austerity struggles, etc., etc. These things have been absolutely central to the kind of society that we live in now. And, you know, there's a constant pressure in academia and in the mainstream to play down the importance of that popular activity. It is, again, written out of history. And, I mean, this is important not just in terms of history, it's not just a historical question, it seems to me, but it matters for the future, because we do live in, I think, very exciting times. I think the Corbyn project has kind of put the question of socialism full square back into the mainstream. I think it's opened up the space for alternatives. I think it's helped to create the crisis, actually, that now exists in the political world. But I also think that one of the defining characteristics of the current moment is that whereas perhaps in 1945, when there was, you know, a big change in the way British capitalism was organised, the ruling elites they didn't like it, they were resistant to it, but they reluctantly conceded because they felt they had no choice for all sorts of reasons. I don't think we're in that world anymore. You know, I do not think we're in a situation where electing a progressive government is going to lead to a situation where we can get renationalisation back, where we can get massive increase in taxation for the rich, where we can end the foreign wars simply by doing that. It'll be an important part of it. But it seems to me that, you know, the scale of the forces that are organising against Jeremy already in the Labour riots, in the media, and obviously behind the scenes in the rest of the establishment, I think, are such that if you think that just getting elected another government is going to do all these things, I think you're living in a fantasy world. And I think it's very important to be honest about this. I mean, we've seen how bad the media's been, and we've seen the constant attempts by the Labour right to kind of push back on the progressive policies, with some, let's be honest, with some success. All of this will be like, you know, a walk in the park compared to what would happen if Jeremy actually did get elected with a progressive programme. I mean, imagine it when the banks start getting involved, when the civil service as a whole starts getting involved, when the courts start getting involved, when even in certain circumstances the authorities, the police and the army start getting involved, then I think you'll be in a different ballgame. And I think we have to say that while we continue to push, and we must continue to push for a Corbyn government and fight to maintain the left position in the Labour Party, I think it's crucial that at the same time as doing that, we point out to people, we're honest to people about the structural blocks that exist to real transformation and genuine popular control. And we understand that those things, in the end of the day, while the electoral process will be a key element of that, those things in the end of the day can only be broken up by mass movements organised on a really popular scale. I mean, this is not in any way a counsel of despair. A reviewer yesterday kindly called it considered optimism. But it's just a matter of facing reality and saying that if socialism is anything, it is actually a matter of active mass self-emancipation. So I'm good. You know, I mean, I kind of agree with both of you, if that's possible. And I don't think there's a big disagreement, actually, between you, funny enough. But, I mean, it is true, absolutely true, what Nadine says, that in the sense that, you know, there's this kind of left-wing development, this kind of, as you say, a kind of slightly insurgent kind of project, which has taken over the leadership of the Labour Party under Corbyn, has opened up huge possibilities on a whole number of different levels. I mean, it's quite complicated. Ideologically, it's put socialism back on the agenda. It's popularised a kind of you know, a social democratic programme. It has, as I say, it's kind of deepened the crisis that already existed for the establishment and for the Tories. It's massively galvanised a huge number of people who were looking for some sort of political home. It's done all of those things, and in that sense, it's a step forward on the path to, you know, social transformation. I think there's no doubt about that. I think the point I'm trying to say is that not that we should make a kind of some sort of crass, you know, polarisation between, you know, in a simplistic sense between reformist and revolutionary. I don't think it quite works like that. I think any revolutionary transformation that takes place in a country like Britain will have a strong parliamentary component, but it's a question of understanding that the two things will interact. What happens in the workplaces and on the streets will interact with what happens in Parliament in all sorts of complicated ways. And actually it will be a kind of, you know, a contentious and difficult process that we face over the next period. And actually, look, thinking about the Chavez project, you know, there was the time in 2002 when there was a coup against President Chavez, and he was literally whisked away on a helicopter, taken to a prison island, and he was probably going to be shot. What happened the next day? There's a fantastic film about this you should watch called The Revolution Will Be Televised. Yeah. And basically what happens is about 500,000 people from the capital, Caracas, just pile down from the barrios, or the favela, barrios, into the centre of Caracas, surround the presidential palace, and demand that Chavez is brought back and reinstated. And that happens. He's literally brought back, and he's dropped on the roof of the presidential palace, and he gets out and reads a poem and says, you know, I knew it wouldn't take you long. Now, but that is a very extreme and sort of graphic example of that interaction, and I think we'll be seeing things like that. The problem is, however, and this is where I've got some sympathy for what, sorry, I don't know your name, but what you were saying, which is that I actually think what the problem, I mean, I'm not an expert in it, I've been to Venezuela, I've read some bits about it, but I think the problem one problem in the whole process in Venezuela, which is now in deep crisis, is that the mass movements and the left didn't have sufficient independence from the Chavez project for them to actually be able to strategize on their own. And I think it was, you know, there were social movements and there was organisation in the local areas, but it was very top down. Even the movement stuff was top down. And I think what we have to do, given the kind of, you know, the very complex and confrontational situation within the Labour Party, we need to have mass movements that will not wait to be told, you know, from Labour Party head office what to do. Because who knows who's going to be in control of the Labour Party head office at any particular time. We need mass movements that are independently organised, that are capable of responding to whatever situation. Just as we did at the time last June when there was the chicken coup on the Monday night. And we got 5,000 people, and I have to say, that was the movements that did that. We got 5,000 or 7,000 people down to Parliament Square the night they wanted to get rid of Jeremy, and Corbyn and Jeremy and Diane Abbott came out, and Laura came out into Parliament Square. They'd just been done over in the back, in the committee rooms, and they were just like, you could see this little smile on their face, oh my Lord. You know, thousands of people came out to support them. That then had a knock-on effect across the country. There was a demo the following night in Bristol, the following night in Sheffield. By the end of the week, there were 10,000 people in central Liverpool. That week, the unions actually fully came on board and defended him. The tables were turned. Now, I'm not trying to compare that to the 2002 thing in Caracas, but, you know, this is the kind of process we have to understand. Now, the truth is, if we'd waited for people in the Labour Party to call that protest on the Monday night, the Monday night, it might not have happened. That's the truth. And I mean, I just think we have, well, just two.
Loads of people want to get in.
Yeah, just 2 points. One is, I think that you know, there's a kind of obvious way of thinking, which is that parliamentary politics is divided between the left, which is the Labour Party, and the right, which is the Tories. Actually, that is ahistorical and isn't the real situation. The division between the left and the right in Parliament goes down the middle of the Labour Party. And that's always been true. I mean, and not necessarily the middle, but you know, somewhere within the Labour Party. And I think we need to grasp that if we're to understand that, you know, how we kind of take things forward. That clearly there is a massive level of various different kind of elements of organisation within the Labour Party That is basically defending the neoliberal project, defending foreign wars, and so on and so forth. And that's an important element, an important point. Second point is that the paradox is that the best way for us to be able to relate to that situation, paradoxically, is, or one important element of being able to relate to that situation, is to be organising independently on the streets outside of the Labour Party. You know, because it's like what Ian was saying. I mean, the demonstration against Trident that was what, 2015 was it?
2016.
Sorry, 2016. That wasn't organised by people in the Labour Party. Lots of Labour Party people came on it. That was organised by the extra parliamentary left, organising CND and, you know, all sorts of elements of people. But they weren't essentially the Labour Party people. And you know, what was more important in terms of, okay, it didn't win, but as a real attempt to keep Labour on track on the question of Trident, getting 50 or 70 or 80,000 people into the streets was the most important thing that happened. Because, you know, and that we can't really address the current situation in Britain without seeing the wars that are being conducted as being central to politics in this country, not just in the simple way that we're spending lots of money on it and that money should be spent on other things, but, you know, the kind of sort of proto-imperialist project of the British ruling class really shapes politics and society quite deeply. And I mean, I thought it was very interesting during the election campaign that, you know, Theresa May really thought that the terrorist attacks, and let's be honest, she thought the terrorist attacks were going to be an absolute gift, that she was going to be able to kind of issue a call to order. She was going to be able to kind of play to xenophobia and play to all those feelings of outrage and anger about the left position on all these things as a way of re-establishing the kind of right-wing narrative. Now, that failed, and it's very important that it failed, but I mean, it failed, I think, partly because Jeremy had the courage to actually get up on the morning after the Manchester attack and issue that statement which restated the basic gains of the anti-war movement and said, no, actually, what causes terrorism is largely our foreign policy. Now, if he hadn't done that, funny enough, which I know for a fact that lots of people around him were saying, don't go there, it's too dangerous, you know, if he hadn't done that, things might have been very, very different. And, you know, the next day, the opinion polls showed that 65 or 75% in one case of people supported him. So, you know, for me, that really supports the point Maya's making, that the question of geopolitics can't be ignored, you know, and because it impacts on so much in British society. I mean, on the pessimism thing, I think it is, you know, I think fundamentally the pessimism which does exist on the British left is a product of 35, 40 years of defeats. But I think it has an intellectual component as well. Like all these things, it's not just a kind of an objective thing. It's you know, that feeling of defeat is then articulated in political ways. And what we can do is, well, we have to try and overcome the lack of confidence and build the strikes and develop solidarity with them and build the movement. We also have to have a political argument, I think. And I try to do this in the book, and I try to explain how, you know, actually what happened in the 1980s is not, as Stuart Hall said and Neil Kinnock said and lots of other parts of the left said, that people bought into the free market experiment. That didn't happen. All the opinion polls show the majority of working people in Britain always rejected Thatcherism, always rejected the free market. But they were demoralised, they were defeated, they felt that they couldn't do anything, they felt there was no hope. Kinnock moved to the right, there was no one to vote for who objected to all this stuff. So, you know, I think we need to hold on to that idea and not fall into the notion that working class people have kind of bought the dream.
No, I agree.
Last two things, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, the question of electoral reform. I mean, I absolutely agree. I think the electoral system in Britain is completely bonkers, really, and it's way too...
Biased in favour of the right.
It's in all sorts of different ways, and it makes any kind of new political formation coming through almost impossible, and all those things I'm fully in favour of serious reform. Having said that, you know, the kind of problems with parliamentary politics that we're coming up against aren't unique to Britain, you know, and there are much better electoral systems in some countries that are producing, well, partly that are producing, you know, not particularly good results. but also the whole process of the kind of the emergence of a new electoral left, which is taking place in Spain and it's taking place in France and Germany and so forth. You know, it's got so far, and it's been important. I think the Mélenchon campaign in France in the last election was very important in providing a kind of alternative to Le Pen and so on and so forth. Those are important things, but they are not sufficient. You know, and even in France, I mean, I think it's very, very good news that Mélenchon's organisation, France Insoumise, is throwing itself into the mass mobilisations and the strikes against the labour laws that Macron's pushing through. Because it seems to me that, you know, even, you know, there is a kind of more proportional system in France, but, you know, okay, they've got 12 deputies, but that in itself is not going to make the difference. They're using that, and that's important. They're using that as a platform from which to build mass politics on the ground.
So you're saying we could do the same?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And then finally, just on the question of, you know, on Tom's question of, you know, what is the way forward, and how do we develop the mass movements on the ground? Obviously, that's a big question, and it seems to me that the points some people have made so far tonight are very, very important. That at the moment, the most important strategic question for the left, it seems to me, leaving aside the debates about Brexit, which are very, very important politically and ideologically, but the most important kind of strategic questions are around whether or not we can pull off a strike wave against the public sector pay cuts. That seems to me to be the thing. And I think the left is quite rusty on all this. You know, and it's not just the public sector, by the way. You know, we had the bank workers on strike, we've had the McDonald's strike, which is symbolically important, if not particularly important industrially so far. But these things are crucial. I think one of the things the left needs to do in the next few months is kind of shift its attention towards the question of unions and building the strength in the workplaces and creating solidarity. Basic things that people could do, would have done almost without thinking 15, 20 years ago, I think almost no one's doing. I would recommend that everyone download from the People's Assembly website a petition which says, I support the McDonald's strikers, take it around your workplace, do a collection for them, and send it to them, or take it down to them, whatever you do. I mean, that actually involves a simple act of solidarity that can begin a discussion in your workplace about how we're going to get organised. You know, there's little things that everyone can do on that basis. It seems to me that those are the key strategic questions at the moment. Having said that, and this is my last point, what is the key thing strategically? Changes over time. Changes according to what the actual, you know, situation is. Maybe there will be some slide towards war with North Korea. You know, that then suddenly will become the big issue of the day, clearly. So you know, there's a constant reassessment that needs to go on amongst activists about what is the most important thing that we should be doing this week in order to weaken the government, in order to strengthen our side. And in order to exploit that, in order to sort of develop the right strategy over time, one thing we need to do, and this is a constant, and I think it's an important element it's a kind of crucial element of the situation, is as well as building the movements, as well as building the trade unions, I think we need to develop an intellectually sophisticated and serious revolutionary left, extra-parliamentary revolutionary left in this country, which is capable of discussing these issues like we've discussed them tonight, in a serious way that's independent of the Labour Party, but at the same time friendly, of course, supportive to the Corbyn project, but which is capable of acting independently. And, you know, that's how I kind of, unsurprisingly, those who know me, that's how I kind of end the book. But I do think it is an absolutely critical question that will be decisive over the next few decades.
Yeah.
On those three questions, I mean, on the housing thing, I mean, to be honest with you, I've felt very, very angry. I think everyone has, obviously, in general terms, about the absolute catastrophe and the the horror and the crime really of what happened at Grenfell at so many different levels. But I've actually felt quite uncomfortable with the fact that there hasn't been a national demonstration about it, to be honest. And you know, I think there was a time when probably the TUC would have called a national demonstration on the question of housing. And
there were protests, but they were smaller.
No, I know, yeah, no, absolutely. I went to some of them, yeah. But you know, I just think, you know, I don't think it's been, and I kind of blame the national institutions of the left for this. I don't think it's been the finest hour of the left.
And has the Labour Party doing enough to address that?
No, I agree with all that. And I think that's important. I think, but secondly, I also think one of the obstacles that people that I've spoken to at a national level have come up against and have mentioned to me is that, you know, there is in the community some people who are saying we can't politicise this. And we can't, this shouldn't be used as a political football, and therefore that has actually created some obstacles towards. No, I know, and I just think, you know, and that in turn, it seems to me, is partly a product of the weakness of the left in the area, that argument has been allowed to roll and to have that kind of impact. So, you know, I think those things have happened.
Because David Lammy, for example, has spoken a lot more about this than
I know. So I mean, you know, I think it's quite a difficult.
David Lammy has been the best in the Labour Party.
No, absolutely.
Nobody else has spoken much about it.
Go on, you can have one question. Go on.
Can I reply? I know that it was a Labour Party, but if you check all the background, who decided to make some changes? It was the government of Gordon Brown and also Tony Blair. Jeremy was a backbencher. So if you check his, he voted against. Yeah. Then I think last year and 2 years ago, Jeremy was looking for review about housing. So Jeremy is a person that always.
Sure, I know, but he has to be a lot more vocal, I think, about it.
But
I don't see him enough on television saying this, you know, or talking about.
As Chris said. Is the Labour Party is quite divided, right? It's right wing and left wing. So Jeremy is in power 2 years, and also he tried to do his best in many issues because there are many problems.
And he's not the Messiah.
Okay,
Chris.
But he's doing really a lot of work.
That's good.
And to be fair to Jeremy, he was down there on the day after the event, and he was talking to local people in the way that Theresa May. So discussing wasn't. I think it's more a question of, you know, the general sort of politics of the situation. But I take on board, you know, it should.
Because also Labour
should be more of a
problematic as well, right?
Can I there's a monthly, every 14th, i.e. tonight, I was very torn. Every 14th, which is the anniversary, it's the 14th of June, there is a march from the Methodist Church in Notting Hill to where it's happening. Tonight, every month on the 14th, and every month that gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it will build. So be aware of that and try and join in.
Absolutely, and don't organise events on the same night, is it? Yeah.
I agree. Many events tonight.
Last two things, yeah.
Go on, yeah.
Okay. The question of electoral reform. I mean, I absolutely agree. I think the electoral system in Britain is completely bonkers, really, and it's way too.
Biased in favour of the right.
It's in all sorts of different ways, and it makes any kind of new political formation coming through almost impossible. And all those things, I'm fully in favour of serious reform. Having said that, you know, the kind of problems with parliamentary politics that we're coming up against aren't unique to Britain. You know, and there are much better electoral systems in some countries that are producing, partly that are producing, not particularly good results, but also the whole process of the kind of the emergence of a new electoral left, which is taking place in Spain and it's taking place in France and Germany and so forth. You know, it's got so far, and it's been important. I think the Mélenchon campaign in France in the last election was very important in providing a kind of alternative to Le Pen and so on and so forth. Those are important things, but they are not sufficient. You know, and even in France, I mean, I think it's very, very good news that Mélenchon's organisation France Insoumise is throwing itself into the mass mobilisations and the strikes against the labour laws that Macron's pushing through, because it seems to me that, there is a kind of more proportional system in France, but okay, they got 12 they've got 12 deputies, but that in itself is not going to make the difference. If they're using that, and that's important, they're using that as a platform from which to build mass politics on the ground.
So you're saying we could do the same?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And then finally, just on the question of, you know, on Tom's question of, you know, what is the way forward, and how do we develop the mass movements on the ground? Obviously, that's a big question, and it seems to me that the points some people have made so far tonight are very, very important. That at the moment, the most important strategic question for the left, it seems to me, leaving aside the debates about Brexit, which are very, very important politically and ideologically, but the most important kind of strategic questions are around whether or not we can pull off a strike wave against the public sector pay cuts. That seems to me to be the thing. And I think the left is quite rusty on all this. You know, and it's not just the public sector, by the way. You know, we had the bank workers on strike, we've had the McDonald's strike, which is symbolically important, if not particularly important industrially so far. But these things are crucial. I think one of the things the left needs to do in the next few months is kind of shift its attention towards the question of unions and building the strength in the workplaces and creating solidarity. Basic things that people could do, would have done almost without thinking 15, 20 years ago, I think almost no one's doing. I would recommend that everyone download from the People's Assembly website a petition which says, I support the McDonald's strikers, take it around your workplace, do a collection for them, and send it to them, or take it down to them, whatever you do. But I mean, that actually involves a simple act of solidarity that can begin a discussion in your workplace about how we're going to get organised. You know, there's little things that everyone can do on that basis. It seems to me that those are the key strategic questions at the moment. Having said that, and this is my last point, what is the key thing strategically? Changes over time. Changes according to what the actual, you know, situation is. Maybe there will be some slide towards war with North Korea. You know, that then suddenly will become the big issue of the day, clearly. So you know, there's a constant reassessment that needs to go on amongst activists about what is the most important thing that we should be doing this week in order to weaken the government, in order to strengthen our side. And in order to exploit that, in order to sort of develop the right strategy over time, one thing we need to do, and this is a constant, and I think it's an important element it's a kind of crucial element of the situation, is as well as building the movements, as well as building the trade unions, I think we need to develop an intellectually sophisticated and serious revolutionary left, extra-parliamentary revolutionary left in this country, which is capable of discussing these issues like we've discussed them tonight, in a serious way that's independent of the Labour Party, but at the same time friendly, of course, supportive to the Corbyn project, but which is capable of acting independently. And, you know, that's how I kind of, unsurprisingly, those who know me, that's how I kind of end the book. But I do think it is an absolutely critical question that will be decisive over the next few decades.
Yeah.